Psychological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. As the creator of this podcast, perhaps the one thing I hope to accomplish in each episode, above all else, is to reveal something new and interesting about a topic you may have taken for granted. Sometimes those revelations may cause somber reflection, sometimes fascination and excitement, but hopefully always a widening and deepening of your appreciation for the reality we experience. Today, I believe we have a real gem that elegantly demonstrates what this show and philosophy itself is all about. Today, we're looking at color. So, yeah, I'm really excited for this one. This is another one. It's off the list. So we were thinking about it. We go, oh, let's look at that list again, because there was, symmetry worked out to be so interesting and cool.
It did.
That so yeah, let's look. And I saw color.
And it prodded me very well. It made it's another moment of humility when I started thinking about it. And I haven't read about the philosophy of color in a long time.
Yeah.
I think about it as an artist. I think about color. But now reading this week and going through things and then thinking about conversations recently that seem to be random, but of course you find the interconnectivity, the synchronicity. Got things to say about that, but ultimately it's so much more vast and immersive than you would expect.
Yeah, no, it really is. Like I said, I just feel like it's elegant. Like when it really is an elegant display of philosophy, because it's something that you don't really think about it. You see color and that's the end of it. But then, you scratch the surface and you can get a little bit, and then you go a little bit deeper, and the deeper you go, the more you realize that this rabbit hole just never ends. So what's your favorite color? Do you have a favorite color?
So I should say purple, because that's my granddaughter's favorite color. And it has grown on me because she finds things that sometimes wackily and sometimes aesthetically, but always seem to complement each other in surprising ways. I do like purple. It used to be green. It became blue. So I could offer another granddaughter observation. Just my favorite color is the rainbow. But I guess let's say blue.
Okay. Yeah, blue's my favorite too. I the color of the sky, like that kind of soft blue color. That's my favorite.
Except, of course, we know that it's not one.
Right. So yeah. If you, and as an artist, you realize this as you go to paint, a sky, you realize, okay, at the horizon, the sky is actually almost white. But then if you look straight up on a clear day, it becomes a very dark blue. So it's actually a gradient color. And that's because of the way the light diffracts through the atmosphere. And then at sunset, as the light has to travel through more atmosphere, those waves get stretched and it becomes orangish and then reddish and goes through the whole gambit.
So we end up asking those questions. Is the sky blue, or are we perceiving it as blue?
Yes.
Does it have its own characteristics in a physicalist way, or does it?
Yes. So that's the stuff we're going to get into today. Purple is also an interesting choice because purple doesn't exist because you have the way that light works. You have blue all the way on the short end of the spectrum. You have red all the way at the long end of the spectrum. Well, how do you get purple? You mix blue and red, but that is unnatural in terms of light. So yeah, there's some really interesting stuff in this show. So I hope the listeners appreciate it. So why don't we start out by asking, like we always do, what is color?
Well, let's start with what everybody wants to hear. Color is the characteristic that every object within our visual range seems to have that determines It seems no. Let's back up. This is the trouble. I was practicing this week.
Yeah, this is the problem, and that's the thing is, like I said in the intro, color is one of those things we take for granted.
Yep.
And asking what is color almost seems like a stupid question. Like you could ask a 2-year-old what's color, and they could give you just a perfectly fine description.
They would tell you the color.
Right.
They would use it by example.
Right.
Well, that's blue, or that's okay. The property possessed by an object. This is what I was trying to say.
You're already just that far. We already have philosophical issues that we're going to get into, but continue.
Yes, we do. The property, and this is dictionary definition, folks. The property possessed by an object of producing different sensations on the eye as a result of the way the object reflects or emits light. And then we can go to pigmentation of skin, and so on. But just starting with the first one, the property possessed by an object.
Yes. So, man, and doing the research for this show, that opens up so many.
It does.
It's just the biggest can of worms because so you have sort of science at odds with philosophy in this regard. You have eliminativism and subjectivism, right? So eliminativism is the scientific position, which says that no, color is not the property that an object has. Objects, in fact, do not have the property of color. Color does not exist. All color is the
function of light and texture.
Right.
Light on texture.
And then subjectivism is this idea that that things actually, the properties of things actually do have color. And I think an interesting voice in this debate was René Descartes. Descartes gets a bad name for the Cartesian splits, right? Unnecessarily reducing things. In this case, he actually did just the opposite because he has a quote where he says, okay, maybe color doesn't exist out there, but objects have properties which cause us to perceive color in them. So if you look at it that way, then, it's sort of a combination of the two paradigms. All right, so maybe color doesn't exist objectively, but objects have properties that cause us to see colors, so it's kind of a mixture of the two.
And this goes back to Socrates. It says color, his definition, which he himself didn't like. Color is a kind of effluence from bodies. Something that they give off. Okay.
Yeah. So this is interesting, right? Because that was my next question is, have philosophers talked about color? And they really have, all the way back to the ancient ones. Which is that's fascinating to me, right? Because color is such an ingrained part of our experience that it seems like something that would be able to go unnoticed for quite some time before anybody said, hey, wait a minute. But no, all the way back at the beginning, people were saying, why is this thing this color and this thing that color?
Well, I think that and we encounter this in all the readings. I'm sure you too, but things that make sense when you just slow down and think about them. Yeah, you put a color under a certain light, or we have to start somewhere. Let's take something that seems to have color. Let's say it's red. We put it under a yellow light, it looks black. Or not red. So did the red change? No, the light caused the change, which means the color is not static.
Yes. So in addition to the two paradigmatic positions that I presented earlier with eliminativism and subjectivism, within science, there's additional positions of trichromatic and color constants theory. These are both scientific positions that have evidentiary support, and they're not mutually exclusive or anything, but they do create a tension among each other. So your trichromatic theory, this is talking about color perception in the human organism. So we as humans have 3 cone perceptors, a red, a green, and a blue. And so as light enters our eye, it stimulates the 3 different cones in different ways, and that causes our perception of color. But then you have color constancy, which is exactly what you just mentioned, where, okay, so we have those 3 cones, right? And we're looking at an object, and that object is yellow, right? And then you put it under a red light, and suddenly that object becomes black. So what happened, right? It's the same object, but the light changed. So this idea of going back to the initial, the scientific versus the philosophical position.
Yeah.
Well, do objects have color, or is that just something that occurs in our brains? You see a little bit of both there, right? Because the object appears to have a color. It's yellow in this one light, and then it's black in this other light. So there's something about that thing has a property that it carries over throughout context. But then also, the light, if you change the light, which is not considered a thing in this case, if you change the light, suddenly the object itself changes. So there's sort of support for both theories of color perception there. And, it complicates the issue greatly.
Very much. It does. I was talking to first, I will say that if you have a human being who's 4 and a human being who's 65, and both of them look at a board book, and it's a board book about colors and shapes. Of course, at the same time I'm doing this with my granddaughter, I'm thinking, yes, but in the 16th, 17th century, the pre-scientific explosion, really, but getting there. The idea of shape and motion and size being primary qualities, and color being a sort of passive secondary, not important. It's not whether it's even qualia at all, whether it's even a quality or a thing. That's in my head when I'm reading this very simple board book. This is a square. The square is green. This is but then you turn to the next page. This is an astronaut with a jetpack flying through space at incredible speeds. Now, that makes a little one laugh like crazy because it's the intrusion of the seemingly absurd. I love it about this book. You get past the laughter, though, and you say, well, what just happened? What just happened is the book is poking fun at what we think we are so sure of.
Right.
And so there's a playfulness in that. So I had that happen this week, even as we're talking about this. And then my father, I check in with him daily on the phone, and he was really not pleased about something that he'd read in the news. He thought it was just ridiculous. And I understood why on the surface of it. He said, they're saying, whoever they are, that the feathers on the cardinal are not red, that you take the separate feathers themselves and it's the light coming in and hitting the cardinal is making the... I sit at the table and I can look out at the bird feeder and I see the red cardinal. Why are people making this so difficult?
Right.
And one moment you'd have to say, yeah, it does seem like it complicates everything. But then on the other hand, but that's not how it works.
Right. Yeah. And that one's a fascinating case, right? You see that a lot in birds. You look at a grackle or a crow or something, and they're black, and then the light hits them just right, and they have this iridescent rainbow effect to them. Yeah. Or, I forget what it's called exactly, but there's a property of things that a thing can actually not have any color, but the structural property of the thing is the exact same as the wavelength of the light, it will be that color. And that is the case of sky blue, right? The sky is actually not blue, but because of the composition of the atmosphere, it happens to be just the exact wavelength of that blue light. And so as the sun travels through and you get that gradient effect, well, that's actually the light waves being the exact same distance as whatever color it is that you're seeing the sky.
So philosophically, we would say then that the sky does not possess blue. Blue is a creation of physical energy, light, chemical interactions, which only exist because of our eyes.
And so, yeah, and that's where it gets complicated, right? Because in that specific instance, structural color, that's what it is. So in structural color, and you can do this with any object. If you carve a little bit out, a CD, if anybody remembers what those are, right? A compact disc. You look at that and you see the way it scatters light. That's because of the grooves in the disc that contain, the musical information. There's a lot of, I'm guessing, I didn't read the article that your dad did, but I'm guessing the cardinal's feathers are the same. There's probably the grooves in the feathers or the distance between the individual parts of the feather are far enough away that they're the exact wavelength of that cardinal red light. So as a result, the feathers themselves are not red, but they reflect a red. They have a structural property that causes our eyes to perceive red. So in that case, it seems pretty clear cut, right? Science is correct. These things do not have color. It's just the perception of the way our eye cells are structured, and then the way that our brains integrate that information. Case solved, right? Not really, because that's not the way that we perceive all color. That's just structural color. But other things that we see actually don't have the structural property of the light that's being refracted. There's absorption, there's additive or subtractive properties. There's all of these different things. So we're 17 minutes and we're really just scratching the surface here. But let's talk about how we perceive color. Should we talk about the different types?
Of the ways of perceiving? I think we can dive into that. Of course, we don't want to drive people away and say, well, this is just getting really obscure. But I think for me, the important point is you often refer to music and I refer to art. When I'm thinking about color, the philosophy of color, and I'm thinking about a composition I'm working on this week, and I think about the processes that we go through, and I think this will take us to talking about those varieties. I know that I'm moved to render an impression of a person in values of blue. So I go to my acrylic tubes and jars and find blues. And then I also lay out my oil pastels, the blues, and I'm looking at them and saying, okay, well, this one, and this one would be 3 value levels distinctions that I think would bring out the drama in the piece that I'm going after. But I'm not thinking about that when I'm actually going after the piece. It's in there, but it's not. But to get ready for it, I want to know what my tools are. So it's convenient to say, well, there are a bunch of blues that are different from each other. So I don't think, well, is that actually blue or is that right? I'm not doing that, and I want to say that because I don't want people to think that we're just disconnected from. But I know that when I photograph my work. And I haven't finished this piece yet, but I've done other blue pieces, or choose your combination of colors. When I photograph it, it depends on what paper it's on, where I photograph it, under what conditions. And so I had one of the many things I've been working on this year. I had a piece that I made out of various duct tapes, a rendering of a bust in duct tape. And I was doing it in a shady barn in my outdoor studio. When I rendered that, and I then took it outside, and I photographed it in sunlight, it did not look like white, gray, and black. It was almost uniformly silver. When I photographed it in shadows at night, that changed again. When I changed the filter and the exposure and the ISO and all those things on the camera, unique things are created.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there's a lot there. So we'll talk about, there's additive color. And this is normally how we experience color with our eyes. Is additive color comes from the light. So if you add light together, you can get different colors. So if you add all of the colors together, you get white light.
White light.
Then there's subtractive color, which goes into pigments, materials. So your paints are subtractive, which means that if you were to add all of your colors together, you'd get black. So there's this cool kind of interaction of those things happening in your attempt to photograph it, right? You have these materials, this duct tape, that the pigments in the duct tape were formed subtractively in order to get a gray, in order to get a black, in order to get these things.
Yes.
But then the light that you're photographing it in is additive. So the way that the light interacts with the pigments in the tape is going to be really kind of unique, right? So if you have white light, which is the combination of all colors, hitting black duct tape, which is also the combination of all colors, the way that it reflects and the way that your camera picks it up with its photoreceptors, that's why photographing things is an art form in itself. It's a very difficult thing to sort of anticipate.
And you need to. Now, I know people who've been professional photographers their entire lives, including my brother. I don't approach it as a professional, but you approach it in a playful, experimentative way. And you say, oh, all right, well, I like the drama in this. This is a complete, and so I end up having 4 or 5 different pieces based on the same initial. So what do you call it? Piece prime, and then pieces secondary, alpha and beta, whatever. Each of which is its own piece of art because of the light and because of the additives and as all of these elements, all of these things, you become aware that it's all part of making that art. So you can think of physicalism, you can think of subjectivism, you can think of eliminativism, and of course, well, I do, but not as a first principle.
Yeah, there's the subjective human experience, and you can talk about sort of the nomothetic, human experience. But then on top of that, there's also your idiosyncratic subjective experience, which means that. Okay, so I talked earlier. Everybody has 3 cone receptors: red, green, and blue. They're starting to find out, they've done some scientific studies, and they found that up to 50% of women actually have 4 cone receptors. And they said that the difference is with 3 cone receptors, you can see, at the top end, maybe 10 million colors. If you have 4, you can see about 100 million colors.
That many?
So
Okay. Right.
10 times as many. So, and there's probably a lot of people that have had experiences with this, right? I talk with my wife. I say, oh, yeah, here's this color of something, right? And she says, that's not that color. That's something completely different, right? But there's a possibility she has an extra cone and she's able to see colors that I have no access to.
But we all, whether male or female, I think even, and that's an important point you just made, and I didn't realize that. So that's another learning thing for me. Same board book my granddaughter and I are looking at. And it says, this is purple. And she said, that's not purple. That's pink. And I looked at it and I said, yeah, to my eyes, that's pink too. Why do they call it purple? Well, I couldn't have this discussion that we're having right now with her. But I said, because sometimes people see color differently, because color isn't always exactly what it says it is.
Yeah, and there's this fascinating, in the research that I was doing, there's this fascinating example of this. Like I mentioned earlier, purple, isn't a real color really, because you're mixing two opposite ends of the light spectrum. But there's other ones that are also impossible, like blue and yellow. You can't see a bluish yellow. That's not a real color. Reddish green. You can't see a reddish green. That's not a real color. But the website that I went to had an interesting experiment where they had these blocks of color, and they had a plus sign in the middle of them. And if you let your eyes unfocus so that the plus signs in the blue block and the yellow block overlapped, what would happen with most people in most cases is the color will just flash back and forth. You'll see a yellow and a blue square flashing back and forth. They won't mix. But some people will actually see the two colors merge. And I experienced this with one of them. Yeah, it was like a teal colored blue and like a dark orange color. And suddenly they mixed into one color. It wasn't a good color. It was sort of brownish, but it wasn't just the squares flashing back and forth. And they said, if you can see this, you're not supposed to. Like it's really not the way the human eyes and brain work. But we know that some people can, right? So yeah, the perception of color. We've we spent the first part of the show explaining just how weird the conceptual abstraction of color is. But the perception of it, the thing that we sort of take for granted, is also super weird. And they say in some of the articles, right, that how the eye perceives color is pretty well understood by science. But once those signals get passed to the brain, they say, ooh,
mental colors.
Yes,
mental colors. The properties that we interpret that we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it gets really pretty wild. So this brings us to kind of the big question in this topic, which is, do colors exist metaphysically or just ontologically? Do they actually exist in reality, or do they only exist in our experience of being?
I often walk the wall between two places. I don't think platonically. I don't think there's an ideal red. I think there are reds that some of us appreciate more than others, as an example. We have our own tastes, which are determined in part by our mental states, by how we perceive color and everything. But does something seemingly have color? Yes. And I think if we were, again, working with kids, and we started off in the position of telling them that doesn't have any color at all, and they're trying to figure out what it is that they're experiencing, it'd be a lot harder. And that's so much of what we do when we teach children. We take the seemingly easier route, which was perhaps the most simple, and then try to build out from that. Unfortunately, some people don't get the building out, and they don't get the. So what's your question again? Yeah.
So do colors exist metaphysically or only ontologically?
I think colors have the capacity of existing metaphysically. And they certainly exist phenomenologically. But the fact that I can take what's said to be purple as pink may say something about my genetics. It may say something about all of those things. But ultimately, I'm not seeing what somebody else is exactly seeing, which means it's something that I paint or do in pastel or watercolor. Somebody else is not necessarily going to see those same things. And that's what happens with art anyway. You have discussions about art and what's there. And, oh, I didn't know. Now I see that that's there. It's sort of like the smiling-faced young kid and the crone, those pictures that you look at together, which is sort of like that color that you were talking about. I have to operate under the notion for purposes of utility, not utilitarianism, but utility, to say, yes, I want to go to an art shop and I want to buy certain kinds of blue. I'm perceiving these colors as I'm looking at the product so that I can make what I wish to make. So I acknowledge the utility, which means that something seemingly exists beyond my eyes.
Mm-hmm.
I can also accept intellectually that that's in flux because of light, chemical, and so on. That doesn't stop me from going out and buying blue.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah. I think for my answer to it, I'm going to take us to a really weird place. So we'll go to music, right? Because like you said, like we often do.
Mm-hmm.
If I am playing a bass guitar versus a regular guitar, that's sort of like red light versus blue light. You pluck a bass string, and the string vibrates in such a way, which a vibration is really just a wave form. And that's a very long wave, and the longer the wave, the bassier the sound. A guitar string is much thinner, your scale length is much shorter, so when you pluck the string, you can get the same note, but the note will be higher pitched because the wave of the string is much closer together. It's pretty much the same as a red light, blue light.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you can mess with that in psychoacoustic ways in mixing, and I often do, where you can actually, if you cut out the lower octave of a guitar, say, I can cut out the entire lower octave, your brain will insert that lower octave. So you will perceive the guitar as being bassier than it actually is, because your brain will fill in the gap. So, okay, there's music. So there seems to be this correlation, right, between sound waves and light waves. Well, then bring into that the concept of synesthesia, right? People who hear certain notes will see colors. And this goes across to other experiences as well. The first documented case of synesthesia was actually Pythagoras, who developed mathematical equations in order to match musical notes he was hearing in his head, right? Sounds crazy. This is a well-documented scientific phenomenon, and it demonstrates some sort of crossover. And I think that determining where that crossover happens kind of tells you whether color is a metaphysical or an ontological property, right? Because if it's just some wires crossed in your brain, then it's just an experiential thing. But I think what's missing in some of the philosophical and scientific conversations about color is the importance of light, or viewing light as an object in itself.
Mm-hmm.
I think that with that component missing, then you're always going to say that color doesn't objectively exist. But the fact that we know through additive color, right, that light actually contains every color, and that light photons are surrounding us, that almost leads you to feel that light is some foundational part of the universe and reality that we live in. If you go back all the way to the Big Bang, anytime you have an explosion, photons are a byproduct of this. So from the very origin of the universe all the way through star formation and everything else, there's always been photons. Photons have always consisted of every color that exists. So it seems to me that color may be a foundational property of the universe, but it's not really talked about that way that I could find.
It isn't, but I like very much where you're going with that, because it has a rootedness. There's an old cartoon where a philosopher says, well, there's just an idea of stone. There's not actually a stone. And another person stubs his toe on the stone and says, the stone exists now. Whether it exists directly as an inherent part of of an object, or whether it's indirectly because of interactions of various kinds, I'm with you in the sense that there is something past ourselves. not necessarily fully physicalist, because it's not that the ball is red because the ball had the disposition to be red. The ball was a plastic, a sphere of plastic, and then red was given to it.
Yeah, you know what this whole conversation we're having is? You know what it is, right? It's if a tree falls in the forest, does somebody hear it, right? So we
think about that for minutes.
Yeah, so we have the ability to perceive color, but if we were not here to perceive it, would color exist? And so we know in the case of structural color, right? Those things that possess a certain structure that just so matches with the light waves, that no, color doesn't actually exist. If nobody's here to perceive it, those things would just have a structure.
Some color would exist, though, if some creature existed other than us. I mean, there are how many different kinds of life forms on this planet that are diminishing, but that we still have. And we know through our technologies that there are colors ranging from the ultraviolet to the infrared. Taking us to another conversation we had long ago about the idea of, we keep coming back to perception. Well, in this case, we could adequately say, well, those colors don't exist because I can't see them.
Right.
And we know that some animals, we have learned that some certain animals don't see red or choose your color. And so would red exist in a world when those animals are there? Well, perhaps not. And it certainly wouldn't be called red because of the linguistic element, which is an entirely other thing that we get to it. Does red exist? Only because we applied the letters and the sounds
yes,
to make it red. What if I called it Bix?
Yeah.
I want light Bix or dark Bix. And somebody's sitting right there saying, what are you talking about? But we have linguistically attributed a name for purposes of utility and uniformity. So we train kids. Yes, that's red. No, that's not red.
Yeah, and very interestingly, this does not translate across culture either, because there are many cultures. Russian is the one that pops to mind, where blue and azure, they have different words and different conceptions for them. Whereas in English, I mean, sure, we have the word azure, but azure is a blue. It falls under the category blue. But in other languages, other cultures, these are thought of as distinct things, and color does. There's that linguistic element. Some of our colors we give concrete names, like salmon, right?
Yeah. Salmon
is a fish. It's also this, pinkish orange color.
Right.
But yeah, red. What is red? Red is nothing. Red is three letters, right? So where did that originate? Where did it come from? Why do we use that to describe what we see?
Why do we always push for standardization? Say, this is where we put things in silos, so to speak, and we categorize and cross-reference and subcategorize so that everything will be neat and tidy. But color isn't neat and tidy. Even if you take a crimson, which is not red, and it becomes the color that you really enjoy working with, and you stare at it long enough, you will see perhaps motion or movement, a vibrancy, an oscillation, a trick of the eye, perhaps, or the interaction again of the light with that color, such that, or that brown you were talking about, or looking back at the sky with the blue. Where does the blue become ultramarine? Where does the ultramarine become azure, and then finally to an almost blackish purple? There's no distinct boundary that we can see with our eyes.
Yes. And this is exactly what I was talking about in the intro when I said this is an elegant visual representation of what philosophy is about, is this gradient, right? This gradient of color. We know from phenomenological experience that red is different from blue. But when you start looking at the gradients and you start saying, well, where does this color change into a different color?
For you, as opposed to anybody else, because for you, it might change.
People have probably had this experience. If you've ever used, like on a computer, a paint program or something, if you go into like the advanced color section and it gives you basically, like a square grid, and usually down at the bottom, everything's white. Up at the top, everything's black. And then going left to right, you have red to blue. And there's a little circle you can grab and you can move it anywhere, right? You can move that. If you take that and you start moving it left to right, try to determine where red turns into orange, where orange turns into yellow. You really can't do it. You get to that middle part and you go, well, this isn't red or orange, it's reddish orange. That's just a visual example of what we talk about every week on this show, which is that our brains need to categorize things in order to understand them, but the categories are really just for us. They don't exist. They're not out there. And so with any of these concepts that we talk about, we can say, well, this is different from this. We know that. But then when you try to trace back the steps, you try to get to the point where you know that thing becomes a different thing, a distinct thing. It's almost impossible to pin down.
You just took me to a side. It's not a tangent, but it's an example. If any of us who have ever tried to fix a dent in a car, and then we want to match the paint, or indeed on a house. You painted a house a decade ago and you want to go back and you can take a chip from the house. You can take it to a hardware, at least in the United States, places in the United States, you can put it, they scan the chip, and I'm sure lots of other places, and comes up with an approximation, often a very good approximation of the original. And you look at it and you say, yeah, that's pretty close, that'll do. But it may well not be exactly it. Or you go to a car, if there's records of the car that you bought, and the records will include the chemical formula for the paint, the tint, the value. And that can be replicated through a chemical process to give you the exact paint. That's because it's a bunch of chemicals being intermixed. It's not because that color exists,
right?
Independent of all those things and then you put paint on the car and you realize, oh, that doesn't look quite right. Why? Because the rest of the color has been burning or affected by sunlight,
right?
Weathering,
which seems like a weird thing to happen if color didn't exist metaphysically. But yeah, this brings up. You and I were talking before the show about how we have an aversion to these mechanistic and behavioral conceptions of human development.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, this is a good example of why those theories don't work. And that's emergent properties. When you take a bunch of chemicals, right? This chemical and that chemical might not have any properties of color on their own, but then you mix them together and they become red, right? That's reflected in human development too, right? You can't just, reality is not additive. And this goes back to our conversation about existential physics that we were talking about, which is, if you're a physicist, you necessarily have an additive view of reality based off of the standard model of physics.
Yes.
But there are many examples of things in everyday life that appear to be multiplicative, right? When you put this and this together, you don't get this plus this, you get this, and new emergent properties that come out. Hydrogen and oxygen, you get water, you get something that has this property of wetness, right? And you can't explain where that came from. Color is kind of an emergent property of reality, right? These things that come around, and the weird part about it is that there's different types, right? You have light, which has this additive property, right? And then pigment is the exact opposite, right? You mix this and you get the opposite effect. how does that make sense? Or the fact that you could just have a structure and that can give you a color.
Mhm.
It's really just a wild conception. On top of that, right, there's a part that we haven't talked about yet, which is that color affects us. And
Yes, that's the whole. Yes, let's talk about that. Because why would we be talking about all of these things? It's interesting. But if you want to go back to utility, but what do we do with it? Well, what we do with it is ask ourselves as artists why we're making these choices. Are there other choices that could work better? What have we hit upon that we didn't, that surprised us? But then we go into an entirely other area, which is think about what we've done with pigmentation and socio-political dynamics on this planet in the past 200, 300 years, 400 years, wherein we attribute certain characteristics to the proportion of melanin in skin pigmentation. And I'm trying to express this without derailing because I think it's underneath what we're talking about.
yeah,
We give such focus to it. There was a reprehensible term that still exists that I grew up hearing in the place that I grew up, which was to talk about using the word colored to refer to human beings. Well, when you do that and you're starting to think, you're getting more educated, you're reading and you're experiencing people, and then you finally get away from the place that you grew up in, and you come to more humility and understanding. One of the things you ask yourself in your mind is, oh, so you think you don't have color and you can refer to other people? So if you're white, well, let's see. We've just discussed white being a mixture of a containing of all color, but none of us is.
Yeah,
none of us is. If we look at our skin,
yeah,
the blood, and so on and so forth. So no, we can't discern a blue that's an absolute blue. If we look honestly with our eyes at the biggest organ in our body is our skin. The largest organ is our skin. And I defy any under a white light, I can see with an artist's eye at least 7 values of pink to red.
Yeah. And so, it's really complicated. I've got a pop culture thing that will bring this back that I saw this week, which was, it was a split image. And on one side you had Obama and on the other side you had Trump. And what they had done is they had zoomed in had little circles of both of their skin that they zoomed in on. And the caption was, "They're right. Orange really is the new black." And what you saw was that Trump's spray tan was actually darker than Obama's skin, right? Which it goes back to what you're talking about, this perception, our ability to look at something and then stereotype one thing out of it is disingenuous to the process that's going on. I have freckles, right? So if you look at me, I'm a very pale person. So you might say, this is the whitest guy I've ever met. But if you look closely, some of my freckles are actually what they call ink blot lentigos, which are so black that they go beyond even being a freckle, right? So if you zoom in on any given part, it doesn't reflect the stereotype that you get when you take in the whole image.
Yeah.
And then what like the bigger issue here is what we attribute to those colors, right? Here in the Western world, we wear white to our weddings, right? Because white symbolizes purity, right?
Right.
In a lot of Eastern cultures, they wear white to their funerals because white is a color of mourning, right? So that's almost a representation of additive and subtractive coloring, right? You have opposite emotions, but you're getting the same value out of it.
Exactly so. So color is important philosophically because of what we unconsciously associate, which needs to be rendered conscious, which needs to be talked about, which needs to be dissected and thought about and remade in one's consciousness. And that's as much true for the absolutely vital getting rid of the notion of race as it is for creating an image that you find most speaks to what your vision is when you're making a piece of art.
Yeah. Norm, I'm so excited for the next couple episodes because here's the things that I'm thinking of, right?
Okay, yeah.
One, when I was talking about music, guitar strings and bass strings and color, that got me thinking about something that we talked about in symmetry, which is harmony. I think we need to do an episode on harmony, and I think that that's going to be really cool. The other one that I was thinking about that we were just talking about, don't lose it. Oh yeah, I'll find it. But there was another one that it's going to be really interesting. But the cool thing is, right, we spent this whole episode talking about color. We didn't even really talk about aesthetics very much, right? We talked about these sort of abstract concepts. We talked about the biophysiological parts of how we perceive it. We talked about how we apply some of this knowledge, and then philosophical interactions. So there's definitely room to do another episode on color.
Yeah, let's do harmony. That sounds. I'm excited.
Yeah, I think harmony will be good. And as soon as I think of that other one, it's also going to be pretty good. But until next time, keep pondering.